Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today at the Oxford Martin School for this Oxford Net Zero event. I am very pleased to host you today to talk through what does it entail to consider the future of electricity and energy more generally, and especially how do we connect the dots of the future with our current decision-making and priorities. One of the most challenging aspects of working on the imagination of the future is to make sure that we are able to link that future to our kind of weekly concerns, our yearly work schedule, our to-do list for the next 2-3 years. By now, especially with this audience, you will already be used to hearing the net zero goal by the UK government, by many other governments, by the international community. But we should not forget that these targets, such a clear point, almost fixed on the stone, was not there only a couple of years ago. The idea of having this panel is to reflect on how other instruments to think about the future, like the future energy scenarios, which we will hear about in a couple of minutes, have incorporated the idea of net zero, and how can we use those tools to keep discussing what we should expect from our activities, actions, programs in the next decade. I should say that, interestingly, while many of us are very knowledgeable about net zero, the net zero target that started only a couple of years ago, the future energy scenarios have been there for a little bit longer. So I have to say that National Grid Energy System Operator, it's an interesting organization. I would say my background is in political science and international relations. I would say the perfect Bavarian bureaucracy. They are highly trained, highly sophisticated bureaucracy that works like a clock, literally 24 hours of the day. And now they're in a process of transformation from being part of the national grid, the largest grid company in the UK, to becoming sort of a public agency. We still don't know what's going to be the specific character of this transformation, but I think this is one of the most exciting phenomena in the governance of energy for a generation. Now, I might be too passionate about electricity systems as a political scientist, and I might be overreacting, but this is definitely an exciting time to work on these subjects. So before we actually move into introducing our guests today and the actual subject of the conversation, the future energy scenarios, I'd like you to consider two important issues that are not about the content of the scenarios themselves, which are quite interesting, but are about the social context and the political context in which the scenarios exist. And the first element is that these scenarios are not a linear projection of change. These scenarios, and I'm sure we'll hear about it, are not about telling us how do we get from A to B. It's about telling us 4 different futures, which we can use to discuss and understand what are the assumptions that we have of the energy system currently, and what are the assumptions that we have about the potential futures. So this is about contrasting our ideas about energy through having different possible, plausible scenarios of the future. And the second thing is to think of ourselves here in this room as individuals, but also representing specific organizations in government, in academia, in businesses, as users of these scenarios. And what does it entail to be able to use something as abstract as a 2050 scenarios on our current decision making? And actually, the two discussants today, two of our guests, are going to tell us a little bit about that, how they do this, how they use these scenarios within their organizations. Finally, I want to bring a little bit of a comparative perspective here. I'm Latin American, and I do research on electricity systems in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia. And interestingly, I haven't seen another system operator that has done this type of work. These are not projections, as I said, but these open-ended contrasting scenarios. This is something that it's being done by other corporations, by companies, by universities. Oxford has itself a program, the Oxford Scenarios program, that specializes in this approach. But I hadn't seen any other system operator that's worked with this device, with this tool. And I think it's quite interesting to be able to discuss this as a first experience that maybe could be replicated in other countries in the world. So now I move to introduce the actual speakers today. I'll introduce the three of them, and then you'll get the chance to meet the discussants who are joining us in Zoom. So first, Sagar De Pala. He is one of the 30 people within the energy system operator that's charged with understanding what the future holds for us. This diverse group uses engagement with stakeholders across all of the industry, coupled with modeling and specific in-house analysis. His background is in engineering. He's a chartered engineer. His experience is in automotive, aerospace, energy, and defense sector. And I understand, hopefully, you're happy to have come to Oxford from Warwick.
Very happy.
He'll have the opportunity to hear from Avi Avital, Dr. Avi Avital, Avinash. Avital, he's the head of the Open Networks program and at the Energy Networks Association. So this is an industrial association. And he's also a member of the Science Engineering and Technology Board of UKRI. He works on smart grids. He's worked with network operators, government, other types of stakeholders, and particularly industry. That's the view that we are expecting to hear from him today on net zero future. He's also an electrical engineer, also a charter engineer, and has a PhD in smart grids. Finally, we're going to hear from Priya Bhagavati. She's the lead research and development engineer at PNDC in Scotland, which is a unique innovation hub that accelerates and develops technology, novel technology in energy and transport. So her role in this organization, in PNDC, is to develop and deliver portfolios of technical research and innovation projects on energy systems. She works on hydrogen, recently more on hydrogen, but before she worked here at the University of Oxford in our Oxford Martin program on the integration of renewable energy. So having introduced the speakers, I want to give the microphone to Sagar for his presentation. We'll hear from him about 15 minutes, and then we'll have Priya and Avi telling us about their experience as users of the future energy scenarios.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Genuinely, thank you for inviting us and hosting us in your beautiful city and your beautiful uni. It's nice to have the interest. So thank you all for coming. And I hope it's worth your while. Here's who I am. I'm not an energy expert, and I'm in a diverse team where we have some very deep specialists in energy, and people who are not, and we really lean on that breadth within our team. As a team, our role, we're called Energy Insights Analysis. As a team, our role is to find answers to complex problems, and often there isn't one answer, there are multiple answers, and I'll come into that. I'm here to talk about how we use modeling, how we use research, how we use some of our own analysis to create scenarios, and how those scenarios are used to plan for the energy systems we need between now and 2050. The energy systems that are going to drive decarbonisation in the UK, in Great Britain. We rely on this sort of interest. We rely on our stakeholders as well. We've got about 400 odd stakeholders that we engage with very regularly throughout the industry, including Avi, including Priya, and we couldn't do what we do without them and without your interest. So thank you very much. And I'm sure every person in this room can digest complex information, but for the sake of courtesy, let's give you a really, really high level summary. This is what it's all about for us. So we, as the ESO stands for Electricity System Operator. Although, you know, as a company, we look at energy generally. So we think about gas as well. Our remit is to make sure that the lights stay on and the energy, you have energy where you need it, whether you're an industrial user or a residential user, whatever, you have it when you need it now, tomorrow, and every day out into the future. So we need to make sure the system works today and the system is set up for the future. We know that we need to decarbonize the economy generally, and energy is going to drive that. This, by the way, is part of the Siemens Gamesa project. It's it combines wind with hydrogen production, electrolysis. So we know that we're going to need to decarbonize, and we know that's going to affect the way the energy system works, and the energy system needs to be designed. We know that there are options, there are different ways that we could get to a decarbonized energy system. One option is a heavily electrified system, electrified heat, electrified transport, and electricity as a vector to move energy around the country. Another option is predominantly gas-based, hydrogen-based economy, where we predominantly use hydrogen for heat. Hint, you know, our message is that you need to use a combination. But we know there are options, and somebody needs to make decisions about what sort of network we need. Both of those networks are expensive. We don't really have the option to build, well, we need to be careful about what we build and how we build it, because all of it has a cost. We need to make sure that it's in the, whatever gets built is in the best interests of the country, both in terms of energy security, but also in terms of affordability as well. So we know there are options for decarbonising, and we use 4 scenarios to paint 4 different versions of the future to show us what happens in those different versions of the future, and to show us 4 different ways the future might pan out. And we do that, as I've said, with stakeholder engagement. So we use that research and stakeholder engagement to create future energy scenarios, which help Britain decide how to build and operate the energy network. And that needs to happen in a way which drives BG, should be GB, to net zero by 2050. And drive is important. The energy, our ambition is that the energy system is net zero carbon by 2035 itself, and that's necessary to drive full decarbonisation across the economy. Think about anything that is an emitter of carbon. The way it gets its energy is fundamental to how it decarbonises itself. And whatever we do, the outcome needs to be reliable, fair, and affordable for everybody, and that's always a consideration through our work. I'm specifically going to talk about this middle bit today, the future energy scenarios and how they help us make decisions. And I'm going to use a hydrogen versus electricity. It's not really versus hydrogen and electricity example to illustrate that. So right, future energy scenarios. We have 4 scenarios, 4 different versions of the future. And they're intentionally quite extreme. They represent the very edges of what could happen in the future. And to work out what scenarios we need, we have 2 axes. How much progress we're going to make, essentially, and who's going to change more. Is it going to be the energy system that's going to change more, which implies that the consumer needs to change the way that they use energy, or is it the consumer that's going to change more so that the system can kind of stay as it is, but you know, we rely on consumer habit changing. So we have one scenario where there isn't a lot of progress and there isn't too much change in the system. There isn't too much change on the consumer side. This is our slowest credible decarbonisation, and we call this steady progression. Then we have two scenarios where we get to net zero. You know, they're progressive scenarios, but we show the extremes of how we can get there through, sorry, electrification on the left of your screen, consumer transformation. This is where in a heavily electrified system, we're relying on consumer habits being one of the things that needs to change, and we model a world where consumers are more willing to change behavior. On the other side, we have system transformation, another way to reach net zero by 2050. This time, we're modeling a world where consumers are less inclined to change their behavior, and we use things like hydrogen for heating and flexibility on the supply side, so that the system decarbonizes, but from a homeowner, from a residential point of view, things are fairly similar. The most progressive scenario, though, the one that gives us the fastest progress and the furthest progress, is one where both we see changes in the system and changes in the consumer, and that those changes are complementary and well planned, so that we do see significant lifestyle change, but the mixture of hydrogen and electrification in our system lets us achieve some more ambitious goals in terms, for our energy system. What actually ends up happening in reality in the future is somewhere in this shaded area. So the scenarios represent the very edges, and then reality is somewhere in the middle. And obviously, the further out you go in future, the bigger that uncertainty is. In reality, these are the axes we use. We have an axis for how much change and how quickly, i.e. levels of societal change and speed of decarbonisation. And if we map those same scenarios on here as they are in our publication, we've got steady progression, a slow decarbonisation and not a lot of societal change. And then you've got the other sort of scenarios where you might expect to see them on that axis. In reality, if this scale was, if this was more of a proportional scale, you'd see quite a big gulf between the scenarios that get to net zero and the ones that don't. And I'll show you that with a graph. It's a bit easier to get. Here we go. All of it matters. So FES, I'm going to call it FES, Future Energy Scenarios, shows three distinct ways that we can reach net zero. And these are the scenarios that reach net zero. So we've got an electrified scenario, a hydrogen-based scenario. Both of those reach net zero by 2050. And on this graph, you've got metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emitted by Great Britain into the atmosphere. Our most progressive scenario, leading the way, actually gets to net zero. In that world, Britain gets to net zero by 2046 and continues progressing from there and becomes a net negative emitter of carbon by 2050, i.e. we're able to sequester, as in take more carbon out of the atmosphere than we're putting into it. Right now, it's somewhere around 500 metric tons. Sorry, 500. At the moment, it used to be around 800 in 1990. So we've come a long way, but what got us to where we are now won't get us to where we need to be. So it's a really important inflection point where we are. The scenarios also show us that it's completely credible that we may fall short. This dark line here represents the falling short scenario, the scenario where we don't meet net zero. That's our credible, slowest decarbonisation, and it functions as a call to action, really. This is still a very real possibility. And if we want to meet these targets, we need to do something different to make it more of a certainty. It's not a foregone conclusion. And it's a scenario that we need to plan for. So we want to drive decarbonisation as a company, but even more fundamental to that is we need to make sure that the lights are on between now and 2050. And the world is changing. So in all of our scenarios, here's where we are today in 2020. In all of our scenarios, on this graph, you can see the proportion of wind and solar generation as a proportion of all energy supplied, growing, to between 38 and 62% of total energy demand in all scenarios. So even in our slowest decarbonising scenario, this green chunk here, in our slowest decarbonising scenario, about a third of all energy demand in Great Britain is met by wind and solar. wind and solar. What does that mean? Wind and solar is inherently, it means that we've got proportionally less flexible generation over time. It means that compared to today, where we can easily flex the amount of supply we have, we can supply more energy into the system or less based on what generators we want to turn on and off. We can't control the weather as much, so we need to be able to have flexibility in our energy demand as much as we have in our supply today. And it also means Britain is going to need the infrastructure to move large amounts of energy around the country. A lot of that wind and solar energy, particularly that offshore wind, is away from the main centres of demand. Main centres of demand are in our big cities, particularly in the southeast, and that's not where the main sort of wind and solar generation is. So you need infrastructure to move all of that around the country, and we need to plan that effectively. So we know that world is changing, and I'm going to use an example here to illustrate how we might use scenarios to help with network planning. And specifically how strategic whole system thinking, as in thinking about the electricity system and the gas system, not as competing networks, but as complementary networks, to help solve problems that might be inherent in each other's business cases. So I'm going to use the word here, curtailment. Curtailment is when we tell a generator to stop producing, to stop generating electricity, to stop supplying electricity into the grid. So if you're a wind farm operator, and there's loads and loads of wind, but there isn't the demand to take that onto the system, you've got nowhere to supply it, and somebody has to say, look, even though you can produce the wind, if you can generate the electricity, you're going to have to stop. And in order to stop them, there's a payment involved. And so curtailment, it's a waste of potential generation, but it also has a cost, quite a large cost associated to it. So in falling short, this is what happens between now and 2050 to curtailment. It's pretty small, but it becomes quite big. So it peaks at about 50 terawatt hours. If I jump back a couple of slides, what is a terawatt hour? In the whole energy system, the total amount of energy supplied is about, somewhere between what we've got 1,000 and 1,400 terawatt hours. So it's quite a chunky amount of energy that we're saying, look, we're going to pay not to have generated. I'm going to map electricity curtailment against wind and solar generation in the scenarios, and compare that to the amount of hydrogen that's produced as well. So as wind in falling short, as wind and solar generation increases over about 30 years, so too does curtailment. In this scenario, there's hardly any hydrogen produced, and we have very little ability to absorb that excess generation. So let's see what happens in a scenario where you have even more electricity. So in consumer transformation, that scenario where electricity is our dominant way of moving energy around and heating our homes and powering our vehicles, we have more wind and solar generation. We've built more wind farms, we've built more small solar farms, so we've got more generation output. We also have more curtailment. It starts rising, but then we see it drop off towards the end, even though the amount of generation output is rising. And that's directly correlated to the amount of green hydrogen that's produced. There's different ways of producing hydrogen. Green hydrogen involves separating the water molecule out into oxygen and hydrogen, and that's done through electrolysis. So you're using spare essentially electricity to power electrolysis, which gets you to produce that hydrogen, and soaking up that excess electricity demand helps absorb some of that curtailment. So in a scenario where there's even more hydrogen in system transformation, you might expect there to be almost no curtailment, but that's not really the case. So you can see down on the bottom graph, you can see the different colors represent different types of hydrogen. So in this scenario, we've still got a lot of wind and solar generation output, which means we've still got a lot of curtailment. That's the blue line in the middle. And on the bottom graph, you have quite a lot of hydrogen being produced. Now, I've just said that hydrogen helps minimize curtailment. It helps absorb excess electricity. It does if it's green hydrogen. It does if it's electrolysis. It doesn't if it's blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen uses methane reformation, where you're separating methane, CH4, into carbon and hydrogen. That relies on it relies on existing supplies of methane. We separate them out into hydrogen. It doesn't do anything to soak up excess electricity. So even though in this scenario you've got a rapid rise of hydrogen demand, which stimulates the hydrogen economy, it's not until we see electrolysis, green hydrogen, that we get to avoid that curtailment. And in leading the way, our most progressive scenario, we have lots of green hydrogen production. It grows quickly, quite early on, in line with renewable generation. It means that curtailment at its highest is lower than any of the other net zero scenarios, and it also means it's down close to zero by 2050. Now that's still a problem. Right? We've still got all this area under the graph here where we've got a cumulative curtailment cost that we need to get rid of. Ideally, it's really expensive. It's in the billions. So we need to make sure that we can. So to minimise curtailment and its associated costs, we need to make sure that we have ways of soaking up that extra electricity. One of the things we've demonstrated here is these two industries can sometimes be seen as direct competitors to each other. Who's going to move the energy around the country? Our message here is if we think carefully about the roles of hydrogen, the roles of electricity in the economy and the energy network, they can help solve the problems that each other bring to the table. So what do we need to do? We need to make demand flexible. So that means a clear message that we can give to Britain is that we need to develop green hydrogen production in line with wind and solar generation to minimize wasted generation capacity. We also need to develop other sources of flexibility. DSR stands for demand side response, or we can call it demand side flexibility. Ways in which residential DSR here is ways in which homes can shift when they're using demand, so that they're taking electricity when there's a lot of wind and solar available. They've got means to store it, and then use it when they need it. Import and export is a good way of managing demand, but also power to X is an emerging way. Power to X as a variable, and in this scenario, in leading the way, X includes quite a lot of about a quarter of all of the negative emissions that we need in that scenario. So I said that leading the way gets to net zero in 2046, and then is net negative by 2050. That's because we have many different ways to sequester that carbon out of the atmosphere. DACS here stands for direct air carbon capture and storage. One of the big problems with it is it's expensive and it's very, very energy intensive. So typically, if you're saying I'm going to help, right, there's some industries that are inherent polluters, they're hard to decarbonize, but that's okay. We're going to balance them out with this technology that can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. That's fine until someone points out that, yeah, mate, but you need loads and loads of electricity to do that. Now, if you have, if in parallel you're trying to solve a problem where you have too much generation that you need to soak up, suddenly you've got a solution that presents itself there. You've got something that helps minimize curtailment and something that helps sequester carbon. And that's one of the things that makes the business case work for DACS in 2050. And that's one of the things that helps leading the way decarbonize fastest. And that's the end of the case study. I'll just point out a couple of other things that might be useful to you. That's a tiny, tiny snapshot of quite a large publication and quite a large body of work. So if you Google FES, you'll find a number of publications. The main publication itself, which is quite big, but split into, as you'd expect, split into sections depending on the parts of the industry you're interested in, and summaries and videos on the website as well. You also the launch event that we have every year is open to the public. And as I said, we rely on a very diverse group of people. So obviously, the people in this team demonstrate all the kind of visible diversity you'd expect. But beyond that, there's real breadth of background in the team. We've got people who've been in the industry a long time, some who haven't. We've got fresh perspectives and we've got embedded perspectives. And then we've got people who have technical backgrounds and other people who have much less technical backgrounds and whose specialisms are more about how we frame problems and how we frame communications and that sort of thing. And all of those skills are essential. And we're always on the lookout for people, wherever you are in your career. Here's a couple of bits and pieces. You can find all of this information on our website. So the main thing is FES, Future Energy Scenarios. If you Google that, you'll find where we are on the ESO. That's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would add to their online materials is that you can download the app of the system operator and track in real time what's the carbon intensity of the grid, just in case you want to make some consumption choices based on how polluting the electricity is at different times of the day. But thank you for the presentation. I think it's been very enlightening. The future energy scenarios are produced by the system operator because of our regulatory mandate. If it was in a completely different context where a company decides to produce scenarios, they would probably have an idea of what they want to use them for. But the system operators cannot choose to do it or not do it. So they have to do it because the regulators in the UK government have mandated to do them. So I think it's very interesting to consider, after all this work has been done, how do other people within the industry, within academia, within society start using these? Maybe some of you actually use it, and when we're in the Q&A, it would be interesting to hear from other stories. But I'm going to ask Avi to take the microphone and tell us a little bit about what the networks industry is doing with these scenarios.
Thanks, Jose. I think I'll start with a document that I've just shared in the chat here. I think it's important to understand that these FES and what I have also called here distribution FES has a use from the industry perspective, and that's for strategic planning. That could be for different investment decisions. It could be for just a strategic thought process, how they map things out. It could be for comparative studies. So whatever be the case of analysis that the industry is performing, these scenarios then becomes a baseline for that comparison and for that business model. I think that's the key point that is required to highlight here, because FES and DFES go through a certain sets of processes, a certain cycle of iteration. So each of the scenarios that Sagar just presented has a certain element of activities from a consumer perspective and some from the systems. And if you think about the best case scenario for us, both of them need to mobilize. For that to happen, then we need to work in sync with each other. So each time a FES scenario is produced out there, that gives an industry a view of where things are going to land, and in certain geographies where the uptake is high, low. And based on that, industry then takes a decision of investing money on some assets, putting up some plants, whatever other decisions that is. That will then be reflected back in next FES, which hopefully will feed into a more progressive scenario. I think that loop is where the industry genuinely appreciates FES. That's my view. I'll pass on to possibly the other panelists to add or disagree if at all.
Before we move to the next, could you say a little bit more? You mentioned the word DFES. Could you tell a little bit more about?
Absolutely. See, as Sagar described, FEZ is a scenario, a set of scenarios that comes out for the whole GB as a broad brushstroke. This is where we are emerging. But from business decisions, or in order to take strategic decisions, you probably need to customize to certain geographies. So these 4 scenarios out there, is that applicable to a rural town in Northern Wales, for instance, or is that same applicable to London? So those levels of customization, those layers of details that are specific to a certain geography is what individual network companies or DNOs then apply to the 4 FEZ scenarios to generate what is called a DFEZ, a distribution future energy scenarios. So these are each DNOs produce their own sets of DFEZs based on these 4 FEZ scenarios. I think it's important to articulate that you add up DFEZ, it doesn't necessarily result in FEZ. It's not necessarily 4 pieces or broken up FEZ into different pieces. That's not what it is meant to do. It is meant to customize or make it bespoke for the geography that you're looking to apply those scenarios. That is what DFEZ is.
Thank you. So we can hear from Priya, her experience from these applied research environments. To a researcher, applied researcher, what does the scenarios mean?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jose, for having me here. And it was really nice to hear from Sagar an overview of the FEZ and also from Avi, the industry perspective. I'm a researcher, as Jose already pointed out. So my views are quite biased towards the research perspective or innovation perspective. So I'll start with just reiterating that FEZ is not a forecast. It is a range of credible scenarios that then allows us to look at how a decarbonized energy system for the UK will look like. And all those scenarios have got associated assumptions behind, as well as what the expectations is for the different actors, such as the government, industry, or consumers. And if those happen, then that scenario is likely to become a reality. So that's where we are coming from FS. It also gives us a lot of what if questions, encouraging us to consider the events that may be initially very remote possibilities, but FES has kind of highlighted that that may be a possibility. So, okay, so incorporating that and stretching our imagination is what FES does, at least from my perspective. And to summarize, I have actually classified the end users as 3 different categories. One is us, like researchers, academics, and innovators. Then we also have the industry and the lobbyists, which ENA is one of them. And then the last category of end users is the governmental agencies, either local or national authorities. So from researchers' perspective, or from my perspective, it just allows us to gives us a set of scenarios which I can compare the solutions against. So even though the scenarios are updated on an annual basis, we can still see all the historic future energy scenarios that the National Grid has produced. So if I have a research publication which used a specific scenario to say this solution will work or is giving you this much benefits, then if I want to reproduce, there is all that data that is available, which I can use to reproduce the research. One example where I have actually used the FES to showcase the impact a particular solution will bring is for my own paper, where we were exploring the impact of domestic thermal storage on wind curtailment. So one of the slides Sagar showed that there was a significant amount of wind curtailment or renewable energy curtailment as we move forward in most of the scenarios. So what we were trying to explore was, can we use something as simple as hot water tanks to then improve or reduce the curtailment? And we then compared and contrasted against the different scenarios, highlighting that even in the minimal case where there is minimal curtailment, having these solutions can have a significant impact. So from that perspective of validating the results, comparing against the multiple scenarios, it's been really useful for me. And we also look at FES as lineup of generation or lineup of demands in 2040 or 2050, and look at, okay, what kind of challenges may occur in those scenarios. And that then promotes looking for innovative technologies or innovative solutions, which then can be moved up to different TRL levels with support from both fundamental research as well as the industry level research. So, and just to add on the last slide, which one of the slides which she showed, it also included hydrogen for the storage of the curtailed energy. But that also shows that there is a lot of support that is required to have hydrogen at that big a level. We can say we want 5 gigawatt in 2030 or another 20 gigawatts of hydrogen electrolyzer installed. But right now, are we anywhere near that? No. But having those ambitions and having the future energy scenarios say that, okay, that is a really likely scenario which can result in achieving the net zero, then pushes pressure on the industry and on the researchers to innovate towards these solutions which can support that or help that scenario be made real. And so that's from a researcher end use. Moving on to a perspective of lobbying agents, I think that kind of aligns with what Avi said. We agents, general lobbyists, or industry will use these fairs to inform what the challenges are, as well as to then say, okay, we need to do investments in this particular technology, but that needs government funding. Then they will then be able to use the FES along with their own due diligence to then go and talk to the different agencies, including the local authorities or national authorities, to support on the decision making. So this then brings me to the last category of end users, which is the policy authorities. And that is where the distinction between a DFES and a FES comes in. So many times it is actually DFES will look at a particular location or locality and then try to bring up what that means. And also at the FES, we are looking at UK as a nation and how then that turns out. But most often, as I haven't read the most recent one, but the previous ones, as Avi pointed out, there is a significant gap between that. It is not possible to just add all the FES and you get the FES. It's not that way, but that could also be a result of iterative process, because a FES says, let's say FES scenarios say that there is a significant uptake of EVs. And then the local authorities will assume that that's likely. So many times we forget that it is not a forecast, it is a scenario. And we just go by, okay, we have this scenario, which is very likely to result in achieving the net zero. So our ambitions are high. So we just go with, okay, yes, we will have these many rules or regulations. Let's say we'll make our cities car free, or we'll have a pollution free zones and other actions. But so hearing these local authority announcements, the national grids or the other FES agencies will then assume that that's gonna happen, and then that informs their FES. But one of the things that we should really look at is that check on, are these policies converting into actual rules, or are they just announcements? So many a times there are announcements saying that we will do this, but then they do not have the associated funding or associated support, which means that there are delays. So this could result in a significant gap. So as FS or DFS is kind of updated every year, it does inform it in the long run, but sometimes these gaps can result in a significant misunderstanding as well. So I've thrown in some of my views, and I'm open for any of this to be questioned and challenged, and that's what the forum is for. Thank you.
Thank you. I think those were really, really, really good points, and I'm pretty sure we'll come back to a couple of those. Let's start the Q&A part of this session. While people here in the room start thinking of their questions, there's one specific technical question that came up, which is about the difference between the UK, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland. So can you clarify the FES as produced right now, they are only for Great Britain, right?
Great Britain, absolutely, yeah. So the island of Great Britain, we have one transmission network for gas, multiple transmission networks for electricity, but FES looks at Great Britain. Northern Ireland, which obviously is part of the UK, is on the same electricity grid as the Republic of Ireland. So that is outside of the scope of FES. And Priya and Avi have both mentioned, rightly mentioned, DFES, distribution FES. It's worth a technical distinction there as well. I've been talking mostly about transmission, which is if you imagine energy as cars, transmission is your motorway network, and distribution is your kind of A roads and B roads, the things that get you, actually home. So they're right, we deal in like big national generalizations, although we're trying to do more on regional specific stuff. The distribution FES publications focus on what's right for their specific regions. Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification and for the question in the chat that raised it. So let's hear a couple of
Just one
questions from
point
the
from me.
panel before we move to the questions in the Zoom.
Oh, there's just one more bit from that.
Yes,
I think it's
please go
important to flag that the regulator is different for Ireland and UK, I mean the GB as well. So that plays a fairly important role in some of the policy decisions, because Ofgem is specifically for the GB mainland. So, and Northern Ireland have a separate utility regulator. So that also changes some dynamics on some of the background, I guess, building blocks and assumptions behind FES.
Thank you. Thank you for that double clarification. It's not only the physical infrastructure, but the institutional infrastructure is also independent. So are there questions in the floor? Yes, please. Please wait for the microphone so that also the other panelists can listen.
This scenario is up to 2050. We're pumping so much carbon dioxide and many other noxious gases into the atmosphere. Will we still be alive by 2050? Because this is a very long scenario, one, and two, it seems a very, very costly one. So may I make another point, really? I sent 2 papers to yourselves on the 27th of November. One of them was entitled, How to Stop the Use of Fossil Fuels. And the other one was Inventing and Innovating, the Platinum Key to Business Success. And the reason I sent that one was related to, we need to understand how to create viable inventions. We have various organizations in government, but they have consistently failed to apply the inventions into the economy.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Sagar to make a comment on the first question. And I'm
Sure.
I think Avi and Priya are going to be in a very good position to say something about innovation from their own organizations.
Yeah, so I think we just echo your points about carbon emission, and the damage that causes is cumulative, and the faster we can do anything, the better. So we at the front of our document, we publish 4 key messages, and one of the main ones there is a call to action to government, to the wider industry, and on ourselves to be quicker at implementing the right things. Sometimes there are difficult choices to be made, because a decision could set us on a particular path. They're the types of decisions that can be particularly slow or difficult to make. There are many decisions, though, that we know are what we call no regret decisions. There are many decisions that we know we can make now and should make now, and are recommended on that basis. And you see that coming through in our, at least in the energy industry, you see that coming through in the amount of network investment that's happening in a relatively short space of time. there's 17 billion pounds of investment going on the East Coast to connect, unprecedented amounts of wind and solar energy at an unprecedented speed. We echo it, and I don't think I'd ever be sitting here saying it's happening fast enough.
So Priya, do you want to go first and say something about how you see the status of innovation, very briefly?
Yeah, I would say I echo you in that the emissions are higher and higher, even though we are trying to control, we have all these measures, and it's not happening fast enough. It's still takes ages to get an approval for any investment to go in. So it's the processing times for having a wind farm installed, even though now there is the technology is almost near mature, but it still takes a really long time to get it in place. Same is for the any upgrade for the electricity network infrastructure. Speaking from, I briefly had a stint at the SSC and transmission. So from there, what I've seen is that it's really time consuming to get an approval from the regulatory authority to go ahead with a transmission upgrade, or it's not the upgrade to a system fit for the future. It is just fit for now. That's what the approval we get is. So it's quite hard to convince that in future, in 10 years down the line, we will have these additional generation or additional demand can be now upgraded to that at the first instance. There is a really longer time consuming process. So overall, we have a barrier from that. In terms of the innovation, we do have a lot of funding that the government is now putting in to promote the innovation, but it is in smaller stints, which then already introduces some uncertainty. But I would still say there is innovation happening. There are companies trying to get to the net zero targets, but sometimes it does make us question, is that just greenwashing, or are they genuinely looking at the solution for net zero? I guess, again, it's a question.
Avi, do you have any thoughts on your own experience on the management of innovation?
Yes, certainly. I think I acknowledge, I think all the problem Priya highlighted. I suppose one of the aspects of our work is trying to be part of the solution in some way. So the program, I'm currently the head of the Open Networks program. We're trying to ensure that the network as is best optimally used. Because whilst there is a huge waiting list for getting new carbon assets or whatever onto the network, I think the onus on as network operators in general is ensure that the existing infrastructure serves the purpose of all the challenges and the fights we're putting out to get a net zero future. So in that, I think Sagar alluded to in the past was flexibility is a key role. How we go about managing that, making it more accessible. And I think now with the current energy crisis, with ESO trying to procure services from domestic customers, it's becoming more noticed and people are more aware of it. Because one of the challenges of many of these innovations or the thing is bringing it all together. I think there are these different strands of innovation that goes on and eventually goes to a certain level of technology readiness level. But then bringing it all together as a cohesive system, which then ESO can then perhaps incorporate within the FES to say, this has made a dent in that scenario. I think as an industry, everybody needs to come together, because it's quite easy. I think we get into the, I guess, we get into these sort of small compartments of pointing at, circles and different things that they haven't done this, we haven't done that. I suppose somewhere along the way, there needs to be a responsibility as each industry participant, what are we doing to actually make that happen? I think that is a key part of innovation that's usually lost, because everybody's so focused on, I am developing this technology and this is like one solution which is going to get us to the end. It's quite unlikely to happen. We need to work with other technologies, how it works together. I guess now I just got off a workshop with Bays where they're looking to have interoperable systems, because now there are so many different technologies, different assets all working together. How do they make it all into a cohesive unit is another big challenge. So I think there's a lot happening, and I can also see that we're all coming together. So, but I suppose I'll leave it to the panel and the audience here to decide whether it's fast enough or not, but I guess we'll find out one way or the other.
So we'll take another question from the people present here in the room, and then we'll move into the Zoom. Yes, please.
In this future of net zero, what what proportion of it could be nuclear, or is that green energy at all in the first place? What proportion is it going to be nuclear? And also, what are the costs compared with solar and wind?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It varies by scenario. Don't quote me on the exact amount, but there's a base load amount of nuclear in I believe all of our scenarios in the future, and that's that's based on what we see being built now. Sorry, what we see being built now, and the expected lifespan of those plants. How do costs compare? In FES, you can see exactly how much by year of generation capacity is nuclear versus wind and solar. It's around 5 to 10% out into 2050. And then your question about how do the costs compare? That's really good. So the way we build our scenarios is we work out how much energy we'll need, work out the demand, then we work out how we're going to supply it, and how we're going to supply it is based on a number of things. It's based on like project viability. It's based on technological readiness, and also commercial readiness and commercial rate. And so wind and solar, generally speaking, together score the highest out of our suite of technologies for low or no carbon energy sources. Nuclear is obviously relatively expensive, offset by the fact that the plants last a really long time. And it's interesting how when costs change, you see different amounts of a particular technology in a scenario. So tidal, it's a really reliable form of energy. It's a great form of energy. It's expensive though. So it's not that so historically you haven't seen there hasn't been much marine generation in future energy scenarios, only because wind and solar can meet the demand cheaper. But as the cost of tidal is coming down, we're seeing more and more of it being modelled in our future energy scenarios. And those are partly decisions that sort of people and analysts are making, but generally speaking, that's we put OPEX and CAPEX costs into a model, and the model will optimize the best combination for the parameters we put in. So in short, yes, there's nuclear in all scenarios, and wind and solar come out as generally cheapest per unit of energy.
So there's a really interesting, we are really short on time, but there's a really interesting question in Zoom, which is about the scenarios produced by the Climate Change Committee, right? Like even before the FEST existed, there was already the Climate Change Committee producing scenarios. So can you tell us a little bit about what is it to the FEST, and when should we use the Climate Change Committee, the CCC, and when should we use the FEST work? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the right academic answer is always, you know, use a range of sources and make sure that you're not relying and leaning on one. Ours come from the perspective of network development and how to build and design a network, whereas the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, look more broadly across the whole economy. So that might be a difference. We use theirs, and I know they use ours to benchmark credibility as well. You know, we make sure that when we have big differences in what we think is going to happen, you know, we try and understand those differences in case one of us has a blind spot. So I think they're complementary. We make sure that not only that our net zero scenarios reach net zero by 2050, but we also use the carbon budgets that the CCC publish to make sure that decarbonisation is happening at a speed that's compliant with the carbon budgets as well.
Thank you. So they're already embedded into the work.
They're certainly complementary. Would benchmark against them, yeah.
Thank you. So we are out of time to continue. So thank you everyone to being here. Thank you to Avi Priya for joining us online. Sagar, thank you from the organizing team of the Oxford Net Zero and from the Institute of Science, Innovation and Society. I forgot to mention that's where I am from within the Oxford institutions. Thank you all, and join us in the next series of events from Oxford Net Zero.
Thanks so much. Jose.
Thanks, everyone.
Obviously, we didn't see how many panelists there are, so I'm hoping had all a decent time. See you, Priya.
See you. Bye.
Bye.